Welcome to this episode on food banks, where we dive into the world of social advocacy and food security. Our guest, Bob Bevil. Bob is an advocacy and campaigning lead at Chipping Barnet Food Bank, where he's on the front line tackling food insecurity and advocating for sustainable solutions in the face of the cost of living crisis. Beyond his work in community support, he is also the managing director of Inspiramos Limited, a consulting firm specialising in training and coaching for corporate and public sectors. With a background in sociology, social work and organisational development, Bob brings a unique perspective on both grassroots advocacy and professional empowerment. Join us as we explore his journey and insights on making meaningful change. Can you tell the audience how widespread the use of food banks is in the UK and a bit about Barnet and Food Bank?
Okay, well, first and foremost, Rachel, thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation. So, data from October 2024 suggests that there are about 2,500 food banks in the United Kingdom. And of that 2,500, 1,300 or so are part of the Trussell Trust network. Now, Chipping Barnet is one of those food banks in that network. And the remaining food banks are affiliated to another charity, which is called IFAN. And that stands for the Independent Food Aid Network. Now, Trussell and IFAN speak to each other a lot. So if any of your listeners are interested in food banks and want to find out more about it, both Trussell and IFAN would be great sources to go to. However, it's important to state, of course, that above and beyond the recognised food banks, emergency food provision does happen informally as well. So a very good example of that is I've got children who go to school in the London Borough of Barnet, and one of those schools has an informal discrete food bank after lessons and at the end of the day. That's not actually recorded anywhere. So it's interesting to think about not just the official statistics, but the unofficial provision of food that goes on in our community on an ongoing basis.
What first inspired you to advocate for the right to food? What was the moment that made it personal for you?
Rachel, and I've been a resident of Barnet all of my life. So I grew up on one of the estates in the borough, which is the Dollis Valley Estate. And as a social worker, I witnessed the poverty that many of the residents on that estate went through. And it's also a poverty that my own family experienced after the death of my father. So from that moment onwards, for me, it became an issue of advocacy and supporting the people I know. And the first thing I did once I left the estate myself was to qualify as a social worker. So over the years, it's very much become my ethos to help the residents and to advocate for those residents who need support, not just only in terms of food, but in terms of the alleviation of poverty.
Do you remember the first family you helped at the food bank? What was their situation?
I can, and part of my role involves a little bit of casework where I can help. And we were approached by a family who were in need of food, but also in need of the wraparound support that we provide at Chipping Barnet Food Bank. And this particular family was a large family with more than one member of the family disabled. And when I talk about disability, I'm talking about mental and physical disability and also an accruing debt, and they lived in some poor local authority accommodation, which was leading to some issues around asthma, COPD, breathing difficulties essentially. And ultimately one of the consultants who was involved with this particular family suggested that the situation in the house had got so poor that the family would be healthier outside the house rather than inside the house. So we worked together, and there's multiple agencies involved, so we can't take the credit for that. But ultimately, the family was rehoused, and they're in much better conditions now, as is the well-being of those members of the family who had the disability challenges.
Have you come across other incidences where housing has put people at risk?
We do a lot, whether it's local authority housing or whether it's private rented accommodation. There seems to be an issue around the borough, and I'm sure it's true of London and the UK in general, that mold and spores are really quite common. And I know that in the north of England, I can't quite remember the name of the law, a young child unfortunately passed away, and it was directly related to the nature of the housing and the mold. And I know there's a law that was going to pass through Parliament, but I think it's got stuck in process for now. But it is a very common issue. So breathing difficulties we see a lot of at Chipping Barnet Food Bank.
How come Barnet Food Bank was set up in the first place?
Chipping Barnet Food Bank, which is where I'm based, is one of about 20 recognised food banks in the London Borough of Barnet. Now, one of the misconceptions about food banks is that many people think that they are the outcome of the COVID pandemic, but it's actually more accurate to say that their appearance is more associated with the 2008 financial crash. And so with Chipping Barnet Food Bank, it was actually set up in 2012 by a local group of compassionate residents from a number of different churches in the area, and they were known as a justice and peace group.
How has the profile of people coming to the food bank changed over the years?
Now, many, many years ago when the food bank opened up, the clients that we were more likely to see would be people who are probably homeless and roofless. So that is to say, literally living on the street. And in 2012, when we opened, that would have been a small group of people. According to the data now, we have two groups that dominate the uptake of our services. The first is single people, single adults, and the second group is single parents with either one or two children. People are homeless but with roofs, so a term that's often used when we get together with the council or whoever it may be is people who are sofa surfing. But we have individuals that live in cars or sheds, and that certainly has implications. But the group that's growing at the moment and getting bigger in relation to other groups are people who are working but are not finding the means to cover all the household expenditure. So the input of the cost of living crisis is now becoming significant at the food bank.
How has the makeup of the people who use the food bank changed? And how does the food bank help these different groups of people?
That's a good question, and it's one that's not necessarily easy to answer, or there are other people who can answer that question better for us. Because at the very beginning, when Chipping Barnet Food Bank first opened, it was for the specific purpose of distributing food, and that was based at the Salvation Army building in the Victoria quarter of New Barnet. But now we're a much bigger service with wraparound support, and we refer to other agencies that have the expertise that we may not have. So, for example, if we meet people who are homeless and roofless in that traditional sense that I alluded to, we would work with partners such as Homeless Action Barnet, based in Finchley, and they would be the experts on rooflessness, homelessness, as it were.
Is there a moment that really stood out for you in terms of someone's reaction after they received help from the food bank?
Yes, and I think it's important to state those reactions are very much linked, I believe, to why we have an army of dedicated volunteers, because it's those reactions that really drive the happiness and satisfaction of the people who choose to volunteer. So quite often we will see tears of gratitude because it takes such a lot of courage to step over the threshold of a food bank, because that is in effect an admittance of not being able to cope in the current social circumstances. So very often we see and experience tears of joy, tears of gratitude, and that's something that we are very proud of that we can deliver to our clients and guests at Chipping Barnet Food Bank. However, there is another element to that, because on site we have Citizens Advice Bureau, we have Christians Against Poverty that help with debt, and some other organisations. And when people come to the food bank and speak to those organisations and then leave the food bank, if you pay attention, you can really see the difference in their body language. In some cases, they literally come in burdened in their body language, and when they leave, you can almost see the alleviation of pressure through having some good advice and some time spent with them. So those reactions, if you come and sit in the food bank and just look around, you can see them left, right, and centre. But the one that sticks out for me is definitely tears of joy and tears of gratitude.
What kind of demographic use the food bank, and how often do they return for help?
It's a good question because you can imagine an institution like a food bank. We have clients that pass through. And there's different demographics. So, for example, about a year ago, we had quite a lot of the Ukrainian community coming through because of what's happening in Europe at the moment. And so the flow of clients and the demographics of the clients changed. But what we do know, and this, for example, comes from the citizens' advice reports we get quarterly, is that there is a significant number of people who come. They might come 1, 2, or 3 times to receive food, but at the same time receive advice and support services, and who do not come back. And we've got an established track record of being able to do that. And of course, that's the reason why the Trussell Trust, well, what was the Trussell Trust? It's now called Trussell, operates as it does, because the intention is to try and bring in a UK without the need for food banks. And it's a little bit early to do that. There is a caveat to that. And the caveat to that is because of the current cost of living crisis, and this might be accentuated by changes to the benefit system, which have just been announced, there will probably be more people coming to the food bank for the first time than us advising them and giving them a sense of independence without a need to come back. So there's an element of a story of numbers here that we need to think about, supply and demand. We have had people come back as volunteers, and we've even had clients who've come on to help as either managers or trustees at Chipping Barnet Food Bank. There are one or two, not regulations or rules, there are certain things we take into account before enabling people to become volunteers, which is, for example, to make sure that they're fully independent and they're not under undue stress by helping us. But it's certainly something we do. And in general, I think it's probably something that should be encouraged, because volunteers with lived experience are going to be, by definition, empathetic to an understanding of those clients that come through our service.
Talking about people who visit the food bank, did you have a story of someone who came in for food but left with something more valuable, like a job, debt relief, or legal help?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to take my hat off actually to Boost Barnet, who are part of the council. I'd describe them as an arm's length organisation who visit our food bank, and they are the gatekeepers of what's called Section 106 jobs. They're basically construction jobs that are reserved for residents of the London Borough of Barnet. And we had a woman come to us a few months ago who recently arrived in the UK from the Caribbean, and she was sofa surfing with a family member and was an utter loss as to what to do. She had no money and she needed food, so she came to us. But in partnership with Boost, who are one of our drop-in partners at Chipping Barnet Food Bank, she took up one of the construction roles which were available. And I also now know that recently she is no longer sofa surfing with her family member, has taken up residence near the family in the borough, and is now living independently in a flat. And this particular client we only saw twice, I believe, Rachel,
Wow.
which is an example of what we suggested a moment back, which was, we do have a track record of bringing people in, supporting them, and then not seeing them again.
Is construction one of the industries in high demand locally?
I believe there's a lot of construction in the borough now with the government's emphasis on building new homes. So that in turn has created a lot of construction opportunities. And the one thing I should say about the construction opportunities, it's very easy to think of construction as bricklayers, plumbers, electricians, and hod carriers and labourers, which was the stereotype view that I had until I looked into it a little bit more. And a lot of these roles are office-based as well. So data analytics, document control, administration. There are several roles there that I wouldn't have personally thought about, but they do exist under this particular scheme.
Interesting. Have you ever faced a situation where you realised just how difficult it is for some people to access food? And then what happened and how did this shape your perspective?
Yes, I would say what I learned when I first started in this role, because I've never worked in a food bank per se before, as a social worker, I was aware they existed, is that I thought that, very naively I might add, that residents and the people of the borough would have access to cooking equipment and utensils, a gas hob, an oven, etc., etc. And it became evident to me really quite quickly that there are a significant number of residents who don't have those facilities. So I can name 3 or 4 clients that have come through relatively recently, and they are groups of clients as well. One would be groups of clients who reside in hotels for reasons of asylum seeking. Another group, and this happens more than I thought it would, are the group that sleep in their cars. And we also have another kind of group area where individuals might be sleeping in sheds or shops of people who are kind enough to give them that space. Now, by definition, none of those venues have any cooking facilities. So what's happened with the service, as far as I can see it, is that it's expanded to be more flexible with the types of food to take that into account. But in addition, we've expanded to support the fact that those facilities don't exist. So at a very simple level, we can provide tin openers. We can provide some utensils, kettles, things like that through our partner agencies where necessary. So that was the big thing for me. The demand isn't what I thought it was going to be, because there are people who are living in circumstances which are just to the detriment of them preparing their own food, even when they've got the food. And that's the point I think is important to make.
How many people go from those kinds of living situations to kind of getting sorted out?
Well, I'm definitely aware of one example of a client living in a car who came to us a while back. And I do know now that that client has somewhere to live and is managing their own cleaning business. So I think it's important to come from the position that if you can provide wraparound support with the provision of food, it is absolutely possible, and I believe this intently, to support people back into independent life. But it's about the quality of the service, the support you can get from other partners, including the local council, and ensuring that the individual has the best possible well-being to be able to bring themselves into an independent lifestyle.
Did your social work training influence your work at the food bank?
So I used to be a social worker many, many years ago. And I didn't pursue that career. I ended up going into the pharmaceutical industry as a senior manager and a trainer. However, what I would say about social work is that social workers are very good, like social prescribers in the GP surgeries, knowing where to signpost people. And we have a professional signposter at Chipping Barnet Food Bank who's absolutely outstanding in what she does. And so it won't come as a surprise to you that the social workers in the London Borough of Barnet are very used to Chipping Barnet Food Bank and will refer their own clients to us. There is a political challenge with that, because quite often when cuts are made at local authority level, the suggestion is that those cuts are made to protect the statutory services, which is the elderly, people with disabilities, people with certain needs. The local authority has a statutory requirement to support those people. But I think what's quite often missed in this whole discussion is that it's quite often social workers and social prescribers who refer to us, and they are referring those people who fall into those statutory requirements. So there's a little bit of a paradox there, which I really think needs to be addressed.
Can you share a story of a community or group coming together to support food access in Barnet? What did that look like?
Okay, so there's 2 very recent examples which I'd like to share. The first one was last summer, when local authority, Barnet Council, decided to stop funding the Barnet Food Hub, which was a centre at the old East Barnet Library, which basically distributed food to all of the food banks in the borough, and also provided some other services to the food banks like training and grant streams, information about grant streams and so forth. So for us, and I speak for all of the food banks here because I've spoken to the managers at the other food banks, that was an absolutely invaluable service. And so one example is the food bank community coming together to challenge that decision. And so at the time, a few of us managers got into the media. We put pressure on our local councillors as a unit. And on this occasion, unfortunately, we were unsuccessful, and we've been battling with the repercussions of that ever since. However, more recently, a broader group, which included the social prescribers, some of the food banks, citizens of Vice Barnet, challenged the local authority on its decision to cut the council tax support scheme. And we made a joint representation. I mean, in early March, the council voted through its own council tax support scheme, which was really quite a stringent cut. And we know for a fact that from the cabinet notes that 18,000 households in the London Borough of Barnet will be less well off as a result. However, and I think some credit needs to be given to the council here, directly as a result of our representation, they have put a discretionary fund in place, which we believe is £500,000, and also some additional money to administer that fund. What we need to find out now as a group together, and that was your question, when have you come together, is how easy it's going to be to access that fund and how that actually happens. Because ultimately, as a fairly diverse group, we all have one thing in common, which is how do we optimally support our residents who are vulnerable and need that help.
So talking about cuts, so recently I believe there was a reduction to the council tax support scheme. So this will be another kind of cut that will impact residents in the borough. Do you want to comment on that one?
Absolutely. So part of the role of advocating and campaigning is to what I would call horizon scan what's happening over the next few months, which could impact upon those vulnerable residents. Now, we knew the council tax support scheme, there was going to be cuts made because other local authorities have done it. But we can't ignore the fact that Barnet was starting with one of the least generous support schemes, and now it is one of the most stringent in the whole of London. But the fact that we horizon scanned that and managed to challenge it, I think was important. But as a result of the new system, it's important to horizon scan, again, the future. And if you think about it, 18,000 households are going to be in a less well-off position. It will put downward pressure on the food banks, but it may well put some households into council tax arrears. Now, the consequence of council tax arrears, because it's what we call a priority debt, is to go through the London Borough of Barnet's enforcement policy, which ultimately culminates in the use of bailiffs. And at every step of that enforcement policy, it incurs another fee. And, scholars like Martin Lewis call this the council tax trap. So in terms of advocating and campaigning in the future, we need to be aware that that might happen. So that now becomes a focus of what the interested parties do to alleviate that potentiality of the enforcement policy being placed upon our vulnerable residents. Now, interestingly, that could potentially be compounded as well, because as we know, only this week announcements have been made about changes to the welfare system. They are national changes which at a local level we can't really impact upon. But at a national level, Trussell and Chipping Barnet Food Bank is part of the Trussell network. We're campaigning heavily against those changes at the moment because they are viewed as cruel. But fair play to the government, we still need to see the detail, and often the devil is in the detail. So we've written to our MP at Chipping Barnet, his name is Dan Tomlinson, and we've encouraged as many people as we can to do the same. So yeah, I think the point there is, keep horizon scanning and see if we can anticipate what we can influence and try and change in the future.
So you mentioned bailiffs in the answer you've just given. So what kind of stories have you heard of people being impacted by bailiffs? Also, I believe you've done a freedom of information request about bailiffs. What were your thoughts on the figures?
We first came across this when we were preparing for the Food Security Summit last year. What we discovered was that of all the local authorities in the country, between 2022 2022 and 2023, the London Borough of Barnet had the second highest recourse to the use of bailiffs in the whole of the United Kingdom, with somewhere in the region of 35,000 referrals. And so what we did was just double check that, because the data was a year out of date, and we wanted to make sure we were working with something that was tangibly accurate. So we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request at the back end of 2024 for the years 23 to 24. And what we discovered was that the recourse to the use of bailiffs is still significantly high in the London Borough of Barnet. And this was in the preparatory stages to understand how we could move the campaign in relation to the council tax support scheme, just to be fully informed. So the number's significantly high, but what was really interesting in that Freedom of Information Act request was that where bailiffs were used, he discovered that only 12.5% of the arrears were actually claimed back. So if you step back and look at the whole process in its entirety, that back end of the enforcement policy, which is to use bailiffs, is actually not productive. It cannot be helpful to use that scheme and that policy to reclaim just 12.5% of what's owed. Now, the reverse side of that point is what you said about the experience of the residents, because if you consider some of the research work that's been done by the likes of Martin Lewis and his institute, we know, and we have seen it, and I've got colleagues in other food banks who have seen it, that there is a direct link between a decline in mental health and the initiation of a enforcement policy. So then what you get is this debate. And the debate is primarily, is this about budget management for the local authority, or is it a question of public health and well-being of residents? At Chipping Barnet Food Bank, I'm sure Trussell would be the same. Our colleagues, social prescribers and other agencies in the borough would say this really should be considered as a point of public health, especially if you're only reclaiming 12.5% of what's owed. And so really that's where the debate is at the moment. And that's how we would seek and hope to influence the people who make the decisions in that regard.
Can you go further into how the donations work? And do you have a story of someone who was really impacted by a lack of donations?
So the Trussell's raison d'etre and central and national campaign is the guarantee of essentials. And we know that the main referral reason to Chipping Barnet Food Bank is that people cannot afford the essentials. So the philosophy of Trussell is to guarantee the essentials. And we know at Chipping Barnet Food Bank that the main presenting reason for our clients is the fact that they can't afford those essentials. So while predominantly we offer food, we actually do have the capacity to offer some of the other essentials through our relationships with other charities and other charitable organisations. So where it's appropriate and the referral is made by one of our partners, the other sorts of things we can offer are data, for example, for mobile phones. That's an important essential in the modern era. We can offer fuel vouchers, again, an essential. We can offer reconditioned IT equipment due to the relationships we have with other charitable organisations. Now, this is important when it comes to things like schooling and homework. In the modern life of a resident of the London Borough of Barnet, school children need that tech to get on at school and do their best. So we have access to that. When it's cold, we have access to blankets, hot water bottles, and that's through agencies like Age UK, who are amazing partners of Chipping Barnet Food Bank. And we also have access to basic transport. So bus tickets is an example of that. We have an interesting situation at the moment where we have a client who's eligible for an Oyster card, but has needed some digital support to get that Oyster card, so he doesn't have to walk to the food bank. So the question is a very apt one, because yes, food is a basic essential, but it's not the only basic essential to live a dignified life in our borough.
I'm interested to know what local residents and local organisations contribute in terms of donations as well.
Our donations mostly come through compassionate residents in the community who leave their donations in baskets in different locations. So at Chipping Barnet Food Bank, we have really good relationships with the local co-ops, the local Waitroses, the local Sainsbury's, and some other retailers. We also get donations in the form of money, and we also, you might not believe this, but we buy a lot of our stock through our cash funds. And it will also come as no surprise that recently we've now got a volunteer who's responsible for fundraising, because at the moment we've got a cost of living crisis and donations aren't as forthcoming as they would otherwise be. And what's interesting about that as well is that if you looked at other boroughs, other areas, quite often the food banks can get large donations from big corporates. And I certainly know that's true of food banks closer to the City of London and in the inner London. But in the London Borough of Barnet, we don't have big corporates. Our biggest employers tend to be public sector, and a lot of people are self-employed. So that the likelihood of generating, lots of donations and massively increasing what we get would be slim without the help of somebody who's taken on that role. And thankfully, we've got that individual. So we'll see what changes.
Has anyone at Barnet Council been helpful in terms of food bank services?
Yeah, I know it's easy to bash the council, but has anyone at Barnet Council been helpful? And I think, yes, there have been people who've been helpful. It's definitely the case that the councillors now listen to us more than they used to. And that's come with the change of administration, although I'm aware we've got the next round of elections next year. But we have lobbied the council on one or two matters, and they have listened and they have acted on recommendations that we've made at the level of Chipping Barnet Food Bank. So we lobbied to see if we could get a housing officer on site in the food bank. And through our colleague at Barnet Homes, who was very helpful, we now have that service, and we believe that service works very well because we've already discussed some of the issues associated with housing. And we've also had Barnet Boost on site who have helped individuals with benefits and employment. So that's a couple of examples of where our requests and our lobbying have been useful and where we have seen tangible differences for our clients. Where we've got a bigger challenge, and this is where the work needs to be done, and we really hope that the council listen even more, is really around policy and those bigger picture things that will apply to all of the food banks. And that really, we're now really talking about going back to the enforcement policy. What can we do with an enforcement policy to make it compassionate, humane, and in the best interests of the residents, rather than being an exercise in budgetary management?
That brings us to the end of this episode. Huge thanks to our guests for sharing their time and insight, and of course, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing it, subscribing, or leaving a review. It really helps. And if you're feeling inspired, take a moment to support your local food bank, whether it's volunteering, donating, or simply spreading the word. Every bit counts. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care.